A famous tech YouTuber once said that good phones are getting cheap and cheap phones are getting good. Whilst the former is true to an extent, there are still a lot of really expensive phones out there. Say iPhone 10, Galaxy S9 Plus, Pixel 2, etc, etc. But in terms of cheap phones, well, they really are getting pretty good. And headlining this trend are, yep, you guessed it, Chinese manufacturers. I've reviewed a few in the past, and usually they promise the same thing: high performance at a budget price. But more often than not, it's just hot air. But what about this phone that I've got? It's called the Koolnee K1 Trio. The names are a bit of a mouthful. Is it worth your time? Let's take a look. So the K1 Trio on the surface has some pretty impressive specs. It's got a MediaTek octa-core processor, 6GB of RAM, 128GB of expandable storage, and a massive 4,200 mAh battery. It's got dual cameras, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and a modern looking 6-inch tall widescreen LCD display, going with the bezel-less trend. Design-wise, it looks pretty nice. It's got glass on the front, glass on the back, and an aluminium frame. But not for any other reason other than aesthetics, since it doesn't actually have any wireless charging. And then speaking of charging, you can really tell that some compromises were made in the name of cost. As you can see, it's got a micro USB charger, which is a real shame considering most phones these days are all USB-C. At least the 6-inch screen looks pretty good, and in terms of displays for these cheap Chinese budget phones, I'd say it's probably one of the best ones I've seen on the market to date. Otherwise, it's exactly as you'd expect. There's a nice heft to the phone, all the buttons were nice and clicky, if not a little bit on the flimsier side, and there's a slim fingerprint sensor right at the bottom of the display, coupled with a front-facing camera, which is a little odd, but not unsurprising in these bezel-less Chinese phones. And then speaking of the fingerprint sensor itself, well, it's pretty average. It's pretty slow to register a fingerprint, and then there's a noticeable lag between hitting the fingerprint sensor and then actually unlocking the display. Nope, still going. There we go. Got there. Then to round things off, there's also a face unlock feature, which is probably nothing more than just a gimmick rather than an actual usable feature. Now, speaking of speed, the actual experience of using this phone is actually not bad. It unfortunately rocks an older Android 7.1 operating system, but it's a pretty minimal version at that. There's a few fairly typical Chinese software OEM flourishes like artificial screen sharpening, bizarre power management options, and a few inconsistent UI changes. But otherwise, the experience of surfing through the phone, multitasking, web browsing, listening to music, watching videos, it works pretty well. And unlike in previous years, using a phone like this for most tasks is actually generally lag-free. Now, the same can't actually be said about the cameras. I've covered this before, but the dual camera systems in most of these cheap Chinese phones, they're not really true dual camera systems. And it's the same with the K1 Trio here. On the website, it says it's got a 16 megapixel main shooter, coupled with a 2 megapixel secondary lens that for some reason adds a little bit more information for a little bit more detail. In reality, however, if you cover the secondary lens, it really makes no difference whatsoever. That being said, the actual photos that come out of this camera, at least in good lighting, turn out to be alright. And that's pretty much it. It's okay. Most cameras these days, if you're outside in good lighting, you're probably going to get a half decent photo. There's decent enough sharpness, but in terms of dynamic range, it really isn't there. Highlights are either blown out or shadows are completely crushed. You can't get a good combination of either, even though it does have a HDR function, but that's really slow and really unreliable, so I wouldn't really worry about that. And then low light photos tell a pretty similar story. They're really not great. And then there's the joke of a portrait mode, which is exactly like all the other Chinese smartphones out there. Nothing more than a glorified Instagram blurring filter. Then looking at the front with the selfie camera, like most other bezel-less Chinese smartphones, they've put the selfie camera at the bottom of the display where most of the other hardware is as well. And so in order to take a good photo with it, you actually have to flip it around and take it upside down, unless you like that up the nose angle. And then photos with the selfie camera are pretty average, and that's being kind to it. It really struggles with white balance in indoors or situations where there's a lot of artificial lighting. Details are adequate, but it does sit a lot on the softer side of things. There's also 4K video recording, it's unstabilized, and the overall picture quality is what I call average. So you're not really going to be using this phone for video recording unless you really desperately need it at a pinch. But let's not get too down on this phone. Its main redeeming factor is its battery life. Its massive 4200 mAh battery paired with a really modestly powered MediaTek octa-core processor means it sips away steadily throughout the day and lasts pretty much the whole day and well into the next without any real problems whatsoever. And that's even with pretty heavy web browsing, social media browsing, video watching, and even a spot of gaming. And so overall it's with pretty heavy use. And that's pretty impressive, and I would hazard to say for most people one of the most important features of any phone really. So what is the bottom line with this phone? It's cheap, it's somewhat cheerful, and it does get the job done. At around $280 US or 380 Australian dollars, it's a real budget smartphone that still packs a punch with its specs. Though the fact that it uses micro USB still annoys me more than it should. In any case, if you don't need a good camera and you just want a phone that gets the job done and works well for almost maybe 90% of what a smartphone is used for, then this isn't a bad option to go for. You can check it out in the link in the description below. Even if you don't buy this, Chinese companies like Koolnee can be commended for bringing phones to the market that aren't necessarily hot trash at budget prices, somewhat proving that cheap phones really are getting good. Anyway, what do you guys think of this phone? And actually, what do you think of cheap Chinese budget phones in general? Do you think they're hot trash? Do you think they have a place in the market? Let me know why or why not in the comment section below. Thanks again so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed what you saw, give us a like, and if you haven't already, do consider subscribing. In any case, I look forward to seeing you in the next video, and remember, say good day mum for me. Cheers.